Anthony strode into the grand lecture hall of the Intergalactic Academy, the faint hum of alien technology reverberating through the walls. The space was vast, with gravity-modulated seating that floated and adjusted based on the physiology of its diverse students. From the towering Crixathians, whose multiple arms held their textbooks effortlessly, to the aquatic rills contained within levitating water spheres, the Academy was a melting pot of species and intellects. Among them, Anthony often felt like an anomaly, a human from Earth, smaller and less exotic compared to his peers, yet fiercely determined to prove he belonged. He slipped into his seat just as Professor Zexia entered, her presence commanding the room in a way that silenced even the rowdiest students. Zexia's species, the Zephyrhites, were known for their elegance and telepathic prowess. Her translucent, cerulean skin shimmered faintly under the lecture hall's lights, and her eyes, deep, glowing orbs that seemed to contain the cosmos, swept over the class with practiced authority. She moved with an almost hypnotic grace, her voice resonating in the minds of her students rather than echoing through the air. "Today," Zexia began, her telepathic tone calm yet firm, "we delve into the quantum anomalies of dark matter streams." Anthony couldn't help but be mesmerized. It wasn't just her ethereal beauty that captivated him, it was the way she spoke, the depth of her knowledge, and the precision with which she dismantled complex theories, making them accessible even to the most inexperienced minds. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a master of her craft, a beacon of intellect in a galaxy teeming with chaos. Initially, Anthony's interest in Zexia had been purely academic. He admired her intellect, her ability to challenge him in ways no other professor had. But admiration had morphed into something more, something deeper. He found himself seeking her out, not just in lectures but in the corridors, the library, even the Academy's expansive arboretum. Each time he caught sight of her, it was as though the rest of the world faded away. The turning point came during a routine after-class discussion. Anthony, as always, lingered behind, pretending to jot down notes as the other students filed out. Zexia was organizing her holo slides when he approached. "Professor Zaya," he began, his voice carefully measured, "your explanation of quantum entanglement within dark matter streams, it was brilliant. But I was wondering, doesn't that contradict the findings of the Tythar experiment on cross-dimensional interactions?" Her eyes, luminous and unreadable, fixed on him. For a moment he felt as though she was peering into the very core of his being, her telepathic senses brushing against his surface thoughts. Anthony hastily shielded his mind, a basic skill taught to all students at the Academy, and forced himself to maintain eye contact. "A valid observation," she replied, her telepathic voice tinged with curiosity. "The Tythar experiment operates under assumptions that are, unfortunately, limited by their reliance on Euclidean dimensions. The anomalies we discussed today transcend such frameworks." Anthony nodded, feigning understanding while mentally noting her words to research later. "I see. Thank you, Professor." Zexia inclined her head, clearly expecting him to leave, but Anthony hesitated. "It must be incredible," he said, almost to himself. She raised an eyebrow, a gesture that seemed oddly human. "What must be incredible, Mr. Kale?" "Being able to perceive the universe the way you do. Your species' connection to the quantum field, it's fascinating. I can only imagine what it's like." Zaya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "It is both a gift and a burden," she said finally. "Perception without understanding can lead to complications." Her tone signaled the end of the conversation, but Anthony left the lecture hall that day more intrigued than ever. He began to read everything he could find about the Zephyrhites, poring over ancient texts and modern studies alike. He learned about their telepathic abilities, their cultural taboos, and their strict moral codes. Yet, the more he learned, the more he felt an inexplicable pull toward Zexia, not as a professor, but as a person. Over the next few weeks, Anthony's efforts to distinguish himself in her class intensified. He volunteered for every research opportunity, aced every test, and posed questions designed not just to impress but to engage her on a deeper level. Slowly, he began to notice subtle changes. Zexia's telepathic responses to his questions grew less curt, her gaze lingering on him a fraction longer than necessary. Once, during a group project, he caught her watching him from across the room, her expression unreadable but undeniably focused. Anthony interpreted these moments as encouragement, a sign that his efforts were not in vain. He began to find excuses to be near her, seeking her advice on research topics, asking for her opinion on obscure theoretical models, and even offering to help her with administrative tasks. Each interaction left him yearning for more, his infatuation growing into an obsession he could no longer deny. But Anthony's obsession wasn't without its darker impulses. He began to notice others vying for Isaiah's attention, other students, fellow professors, even academy officials. Each interaction she had with someone else felt like a personal affront, a reminder that he was not the center of her world. This realization gnawed at him, fueling a simmering jealousy he struggled to contain. One evening, while researching in the Academy's database, Anthony stumbled upon a restricted file. It was labeled with Exalia's name, its access limited to senior faculty. Driven by a dangerous mix of curiosity and obsession, Anthony bypassed the security protocols, a risky move that could cost him his place at the Academy. What he found within the file left him stunned: records of Exalia's tragic past, her exile from her homeworld, and the scandal that had forced her to seek refuge in the Intergalactic Academy. For most, these revelations would have evoked sympathy, perhaps even respect for her resilience. But for Anthony, they became tools, pieces of a puzzle he could use to draw closer to her. Armed with this forbidden knowledge, he crafted his next move, determined to prove to Saya that he understood her in ways no one else could. As the weeks turned into months, Anthony's obsession deepened. He was no longer content with fleeting moments of connection or stolen glances. He wanted more, needed more. And in his mind, he was willing to do whatever it took to make Zaya see him not as a student, but as an equal, a confidant, perhaps even something more. Xylia, for her part, began to sense the shift in Anthony's demeanor. Her telepathic abilities allowed her to perceive the subtle undercurrents of his thoughts, the growing intensity of his emotions. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the idealistic fervor of youth. But as Anthony's actions became more calculated, more intrusive, she found herself increasingly uneasy. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a dangerous spiral that would threaten to consume them both. Anthony's fixation with Exia had grown into a relentless force that consumed his every thought. In the weeks following his discovery of her hidden past, he became a man with a singular purpose to forge a connection with her that transcended the boundaries of their professional relationship. What had begun as admiration had twisted into an obsessive need to be the only one who truly understood her. He spent hours poring over the restricted file he had illegally accessed, studying every detail of her life. Nexalia's exile from her homeworld had been the result of a cultural taboo. Her telepathic species placed immense value on emotional restraint, and any display of vulnerability was considered a weakness. According to the records, Exalia had broken this sacred code during a public trial, revealing her grief over the loss of a family member. Her own people had turned against her, deeming her unfit to serve in her position of authority. Stripped of her title and forced to leave her home, she had sought refuge in the Intergalactic Academy, where her brilliance and expertise were recognized despite her personal disgrace. For Anthony, this revelation was a turning point. He no longer saw Exia as an untouchable figure of authority, but as someone flawed, someone human in her own way. He convinced himself that her exile was an opportunity, a void he could fill with his unwavering devotion. In his mind, he wasn't just a student anymore, he was her savior, the one person who could see beyond her mistakes and accept her for who she truly was. Driven by this delusion, Anthony began orchestrating ways to insert himself into Xelia's life. He volunteered for every additional assignment she offered, staying late after lectures under the guise of seeking clarification on complex topics. He studied her habits, learning the times she frequented the Academy's arboretum, the library, and even the faculty lounge. Subtlety became his weapon, small acts designed to make her notice him, to make her believe he was more than just another student. One evening, Anthony waited in the arboretum, knowing Exia often went there to meditate. The space was serene, with bioluminescent plants casting a soft glow and the gentle hum of alien insects filling the air. When she arrived, Anthony was already seated on a bench, pretending to read a book on quantum field theory. He glanced up as she approached, feigning surprise. "Professor Zaya," he said, rising to his feet. "I didn't expect to see you here." She paused, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Kale," she replied telepathically. "The Arboretum is a place of reflection. It is unusual to find students here at this hour." Anthony shrugged, adopting a casual tone. "I find it easier to focus here. The quiet helps me think." He hesitated, as if deliberating whether to continue. "Actually, I've been struggling with something you mentioned in class today about the quantum interference patterns in dark matter streams. It's fascinating, but I can't seem to wrap my head around the practical applications." Exilia regarded him for a moment before gesturing for him to sit. Practical applications are often a secondary concern in theoretical studies. However, I will explain. As she began to speak, Anthony leaned in, absorbing every word, not for the sake of understanding but for the sheer pleasure of being in her presence. He asked questions that he knew would prolong the conversation, subtly steering it toward broader topics about her experiences and insights. For the first time, Zaya shared glimpses of her personal philosophy, her belief in the interconnectedness of all things, a belief rooted in her species' telepathic understanding of the universe. Anthony listened intently, his admiration for her deepening with every word. When their conversation ended, he thanked her profusely, ensuring she knew how much he valued her time. As Exilia departed, Anthony felt a surge of triumph. He was certain he had planted the seeds of a bond, one that he could nurture into something greater. But Anthony's obsession began to take darker turns. He started monitoring Zaya's schedule more closely, using his access to the Academy's network to track her movements. He justified his actions as harmless. After all, he wasn't hurting anyone. Yet his behavior became increasingly invasive. He discovered her preferred meals from the cafeteria logs, her favorite texts from library checkouts, and even her private research topics through encrypted files. Each piece of information became another thread in the tapestry he was weaving, a tapestry in which he envisioned himself as the center of her world. His jealousy, too, became an uncontrollable force. When he noticed another student lingering after class to ask Exilia questions, Anthony seethed with anger. He began to view anyone who interacted with her as a rival, a threat to his imagined connection. On one occasion, he deliberately sabotaged a fellow student's research presentation, ensuring that Exilia's attention would be directed toward him instead. Exilia, for her part, began to notice the subtle changes in Anthony's behavior. His questions became more personal, his presence more frequent. At first, she dismissed it as enthusiasm, a trait she admired in her students. But as the weeks passed, she sensed an intensity in his thoughts that unsettled her. Her telepathic abilities allowed her to perceive the emotions of those around her, and Anthony's emotions were like a storm, chaotic and overwhelming. One afternoon, after a particularly probing conversation with Anthony, Exilia retreated to her quarters, seeking solace in the quiet of her private space. She meditated, reaching out with her mind to center herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Anthony's thoughts had lingered in her mind, not as words but as impressions, fragments of longing, frustration, and something darker. She resolved to keep a closer watch on him, unsure whether her concerns were justified or merely a product of her own past traumas. Meanwhile, Anthony's fixation reached a new level of intensity. Unable to resist the temptation, he hacked into Exilia's personal communications, reading her messages to colleagues and family. He told himself it was a way to understand her better, to anticipate her needs and desires. But the more he learned, the more his obsession consumed him. He began to fantasize about scenarios in which he could rescue her from imagined dangers, positioning himself as her savior and protector. One night, as Anthony sat in his dormitory, staring at a holographic image of Exilia from the Academy's database, he made a decision. He would find a way to make her see him, not as a student, but as someone who truly understood her. In his mind, their connection was destined, a bond that transcended the boundaries of species and convention. He was willing to do whatever it took to make her realize that. But Anthony's actions were not without consequence. His frequent presence in Exilia's life began to attract attention from others. Fellow students whispered about his favoritism, and a few professors noticed his unusual behavior. Yet Anthony was undeterred. He was convinced that his devotion would ultimately win Exilia over, blind to the fact that his obsession was driving him down a path of no return. Zaya, still unaware of the extent of Anthony's fixation, continued to engage with him professionally, though her unease grew with each interaction. She could sense that something was amiss, but she struggled to pinpoint the source of her discomfort. Little did she know, the storm brewing within Anthony was about to unleash itself in ways that would change both of their lives forever. Anthony's obsession had reached a tipping point. No longer content with stolen moments or subtle manipulations, he began to act with reckless abandon. The line between admiration and possession blurred entirely in his mind, and he convinced himself that Exalia's growing unease was not a result of his actions but a sign that she, too, felt the connection he so desperately craved. One evening, Anthony sat in his dormitory, staring at the dim glow of his holoscreen. A private message flickered on the screen. It was a reminder from the Academy's system about an upcoming ethics seminar. He scoffed at the irony. Ethics were irrelevant in the face of what he believed was a transcendent bond. To him, this was no longer about right or wrong. It was about destiny. He opened the secure folder where he had stored everything he had learned about Exalia, her past, her habits, even the telepathic exercises she used to calm her mind. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, but now, as he prepared to act, a thrill of anticipation mixed with an undercurrent of fear. Tonight, he would make her see him, truly see him, and he was ready to do whatever it took to make that happen. Exalia, unaware of Anthony's plans, sat alone in her quarters. The soft luminescence of the walls cast an ethereal glow across the room, and the faint hum of the Academy's life support systems was the only sound. She had just finished grading assignments and was preparing to meditate. Her quarters were her sanctuary, a place where she could lower the mental barriers she constantly maintained in the presence of others. Yet even here, she couldn't shake the persistent feeling of being watched, as though someone's thoughts were brushing against her own. She closed her eyes, reaching out telepathically to ground herself. But instead of the calm she sought, she felt a ripple of unease, a presence that seemed just out of reach. Her eyes snapped open, her luminescent skin glowing faintly as her instincts flared. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced before, a mixture of familiarity and intrusion. It was as though someone had tapped into her mind without her consent, leaving faint traces of their presence. Before she could analyze the feeling further, the chime of her door interrupted her thoughts. Exalia's brow furrowed. It was late, and she rarely received visitors at this hour. Rising gracefully, she approached the door, her mind already scanning for potential threats. When the door slid open, she was surprised to see Anthony standing there, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Kale," she said, her telepathic voice calm but firm, "it is late. Is there something urgent you need?" Anthony hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "Professor, I need to talk to you. It's important." Exalia's unease deepened. She could sense the intensity of his emotions radiating from him, a storm of conflicting thoughts and feelings. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "You have 5 minutes," she said, gesturing for him to sit. Anthony entered the room, his eyes darting around as though trying to memorize every detail. He sat down but didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stared at her, his gaze filled with an unsettling mix of admiration and desperation. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in class," he began, his voice shaky but determined. "About interconnectedness. How everything in the universe is connected, even across impossible distances." Exalia nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, it is a fundamental principle of quantum theory." Anthony leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists. "But it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just science, it's a truth that applies to everything, to everyone. You and I, we're connected. I can feel it." Exalia stiffened, her luminous eyes narrowing. "Mr. Kale, I believe you are misinterpreting my teachings. Our connection is that of teacher and student, nothing more." Anthony shook his head vehemently. "No, it's more than that. I know it is. I can feel it every time I'm near you, every time you speak. You understand me in ways no one else ever has." Exalia's unease turned to alarm as she realized the depth of his delusion. "Anthony," she said, abandoning her formal tone, "you are projecting your feelings onto me. This is not healthy. I suggest you speak with the Academy's counselors." "No." Anthony's voice rose and he stood abruptly. "You don't understand. I've done everything for you. I've studied your work, learned about your past, even protected you from people who don't appreciate you. I'm the only one who truly sees you." Exalia's heart raced as she sensed the volatility in his thoughts. She took a step back, her mind instinctively raising barriers to protect herself. "You invaded my privacy," she said, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. "You accessed information you had no right to see. This is a serious breach of trust." Anthony's expression shifted, a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I did it because I care about you. Because I know what you've been through. I know how they treated you on your homeworld, how they didn't understand you. But I do. I would never abandon you like they did." Axia's mind raced as she tried to de-escalate the situation. "Anthony, listen to me. What you're feeling is not real. It is an illusion created by your emotions. You need to let this go before it consumes you." But Anthony was beyond reason. "You're wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I know you feel it too. I've seen the way you look at me, the way you linger when we talk. You're just afraid to admit it." Axia's patience snapped. "Enough," she said, her telepathic voice carrying the weight of her authority. "Leave my quarters immediately. This conversation is over." Anthony froze, the force of her words hitting him like a physical blow. For a moment he looked as though he might comply, but then his expression hardened. "No," he said quietly. "I won't leave until you admit the truth." Axia's instinct screamed at her to call for security, but she hesitated, not wanting to escalate the situation further. Instead, she took a deep breath and reached out telepathically, probing the surface of Anthony's thoughts. What she found left her shaken, a chaotic swirl of obsession, jealousy, and despair. He truly believed that their connection was real, that they were meant to be together. Realizing the depth of his delusion, Axia spoke again, her voice softer but no less firm. "Anthony, you are unwell. You need help. Please, let me call someone who can assist you." Anthony's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she thought he might relent. But then he took a step closer, his expression darkening. "I don't need help," he said. "I need you." Before Axia could respond, the door to her quarters slid open, and a security officer stepped inside. The Academy's surveillance system had detected the unauthorized presence of a student in a faculty member's quarters and dispatched help. Anthony turned to face the officer, his body tense and trembling. "Anthony Cale," the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Step away from Professor Xia and come with me." Anthony looked back at Xylia, his expression a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. "You called them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't," Xylia replied, her tone filled with both relief and regret. "But this needs to end." As the officer escorted Anthony out, Axia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this. She knew this was not the end of the ordeal. Anthony's obsession was a storm that had yet to fully break. And when it did, she feared the damage it would leave in its wake. The Academy seemed quieter in the days following Anthony's removal from Xya's quarters, yet for Axia, the silence was anything but comforting. She carried an invisible weight, a nagging sense of unease that Anthony's obsession would not simply dissolve with his absence. She had seen the storm within his mind, a volatile mix of longing and desperation that wouldn't be easily subdued. Despite assurances from the Academy's administration that the situation was under control, Axia found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her telepathic senses alert to the faintest disturbance. Anthony had been placed under temporary suspension and was required to attend psychological evaluations as a condition for his return. For most students, this would have been a sobering experience, a chance to reflect and seek help. But Anthony wasn't most students. Alone in his dormitory, he replayed the events of that fateful night over and over, each iteration deepening his conviction that he had been wronged not just by Xia, but by everyone who had interfered. He had loved her. He still loved her, and in his mind, her rejection was not a denial of their connection but a cry for help, a plea for him to break through the walls she had built around herself. He believed she was too afraid to embrace what they shared, too bound by the expectations of her species and her position to admit the truth. But Anthony wasn't afraid. He would do what was necessary to show her that they belonged together, no matter the cost. The first step was to regain access to the Academy. Using the skills he had honed while hacking into restricted files, Anthony bypassed the security protocols that had locked him out of the network. He monitored communications between the administration and Exilia, searching for vulnerabilities he could exploit. He discovered that Exilia had requested additional security measures for her quarters and that she had begun conducting her lectures remotely, avoiding in-person interactions with students. Anthony's heart ached at the thought of her isolating herself. He convinced himself that her actions were a result of fear, not of him but of the feelings she was suppressing. He vowed to reach her, to prove that she didn't need to be afraid anymore. One night, while the academy was quiet and most students were asleep, Anthony made his move. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying a small device he had modified to disable the security systems, he slipped through the corridors like a shadow. His destination was Exilia's quarters. He knew she would be there. Her routine had become predictable, a testament to her disciplined nature. When he reached her door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the control panel. Doubt flickered in his mind, a faint whisper questioning the path he had chosen. But he silenced it, reminding himself of his purpose. He activated the device, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Exilia was seated in the center of the room, her legs crossed in a meditative pose. Her eyes snapped open the moment the door breached, and her luminous skin flared brightly as her telepathic senses screamed a warning. She rose to her feet, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "Anthony," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing here? You are violating every protocol of this academy." Anthony stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. "I had to see you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You've shut me out, and I couldn't just let that happen. You need to hear me out." Exilia took a step back, raising a hand in a gesture of warning. "This ends now, Anthony. Leave before you make things worse for yourself." But Anthony was undeterred. "No, this doesn't end here. It can't. You don't understand. I've done everything for you. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be. I'll protect you, no matter what." Exilia's mind raced as she assessed the situation. She could feel the instability in his thoughts, the intensity of his emotions. Reasoning with him seemed futile, but escalating the confrontation could be dangerous. She needed to find a way to diffuse the situation before it spiraled out of control. "Anthony," she said, her tone softening slightly. "I understand that you believe you're helping me, but this is not the way. Your actions are harming both of us. Please, let me call someone who can help you." Anthony shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You don't get it, do you? I don't need help. I need you, and I know you feel the same way. You just won't admit it." Exilia's heart ached with a mixture of pity and fear. She could sense the depth of his pain, the distorted love that had driven him to this point. But she also knew she couldn't allow his delusion to continue. Gathering her resolve, she reached out telepathically, not to probe his thoughts but to project a sense of calm and clarity. Anthony flinched as he felt her presence in his mind. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Don't try to manipulate me." "I'm not manipulating you," Saya replied. "I'm trying to help you see the truth. What you're feeling isn't love, Anthony. It's a projection of your own needs and desires. It's not real." Her words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment he looked as though he might crumble, his shoulders slumping and his expression faltering. But then his face twisted with anger. "You're lying," he said, his voice shaking. "You're just like the rest of them. You don't care about me. You never did." Exilia's luminous eyes glimmered with sadness. "Anthony, I care about all my students. But the relationship you're imagining is impossible. It goes against everything I stand for, everything I believe in." Anthony's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "If I can't have you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then no one can." The words sent a chill down Exilia's spine. She realized she was out of time. Activating a hidden alarm on her wristband, she stepped back, raising her telepathic barriers to their maximum strength. Anthony lunged toward her, his movements driven by desperation rather than strategy. But before he could reach her, the door to her quarters burst open, and 2 security officers stormed in. Anthony froze as the officers trained their stun weapons on him. "Anthony Kale," one of them said, "stand down and step away from Professor Zalia." Anthony's gaze darted between Exilia and the officers, his body trembling with rage and despair. "You don't understand. he shouted. "She's the only one who ever understood me." The officers moved quickly, restraining him before he could resist. As they escorted him out, Anthony looked back at Zaya, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and betrayal. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You'll see." When the door slid shut behind them, Exilia sank into a chair, her luminous glow dimming as the adrenaline drained from her body. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a lingering sadness. Anthony's actions had been wrong, but his pain was real. She could only hope that he would find the help he needed. In the days that followed, Exilia worked with the Academy's administration to strengthen security measures and ensure that Anthony received proper care. She resumed her lectures, determined not to let the incident define her or disrupt her work. But the experience left a mark, a reminder of the delicate balance between connection and boundaries in a world where emotions and intellect often collided. For Anthony, the consequences were severe. He was expelled from the academy and placed under mandatory psychological evaluation. Despite his actions, Exilia ensured that he was treated with compassion, advocating for his rehabilitation rather than punishment. She hoped that, in time, he would heal and find a path that didn't depend on the illusion of a connection that had never truly existed. As the academy returned to normal, Exilia reflected on the events that had transpired. She had faced challenges before, but this had been different, more personal, more painful. Yet in the end, she chose to view it not as a failure but as a lesson, a reminder of the strength required to navigate the complexities of teaching and the vulnerabilities that came with being truly seen. And so, life went on, the echoes of Anthony's obsession fading into the past. But Exilia never forgot the storm that had nearly consumed them both, a storm born of longing, misunderstanding, and the fragile human need to be loved.